I think that we need to repeal the Conservative and Liberal Democrat health bill, and we have made that a promise in our election campaign. We do not want to see it opened up.
Do you want no more private involvement in the NHS?
What the government has done with their top-down reorganisation that they promised wouldn't happen before the last election, and which happened pretty soon afterwards because everyone was too scared to say that they didn't understand what Andrew Lansley was talking about, is that they've opened the NHS, every NHS service up to any willing provider. That means any company from anywhere can come in and run our National Health Service. That is a recipe for inefficiency, it's a recipe for cost going up, and it's a recipe for privatisation and co-payments, which is the ideological end of this Conservative and Lib Dem coalition.
Do you want to see the private sector playing a part in the NHS or not?
The private sector was used by Labour in government to tackle certain problems. Health waiting lists where people were waiting 18 months for cataract operations and going blind. Hip replacements where people were living in pain, and heart operations where they were dying before they were getting their treatment. We used the private sector to effectively stop the consultants from having large waiting lists and doing it. We bought in bulk purchasing, using the NHS's purchasing power to tackle those NHS waiting lists. And yes, there is a place for it, but not opening up every single service. And of course, in some services,
running Hinchinbrook Hospital.
And in some services, like sexual health and some mental health services, the voluntary sector is doing a magnificent job in that. But it cannot just be come one, come all.
But you were the only people to privatise a hospital.
No, that was done after we left government.
But it was done when a choice was left only between two private providers and the NHS had been excluded.
There were 3 providers that were in the race when we left government.
Camilla Cavendish.
There were, and that's the thing you can't really avoid. But I mean, I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, I just think if you can't... The reason the Labour government did that was because that particular hospital was failing. It was not giving good care. It was the bottom of all the lists. They had a choice. Were they going to close it, or were they going to try and see if there was a better way of doing something? They tendered it out. You ended up with 3 private sector providers, one of which got the contract. The one that got the contract is actually half owned by the doctors. Time will tell, but I don't actually necessarily think that's a bad thing if it gets to better care. Can I just come on? This is an issue that people write to me about so much, this question that you've put.
What, privatising the NHS?
The issue of privatising. Can I just say, at the beginning, this word privatisation, Mary, that you've used is so misleading. And I think we just have to start with that. Privatisation means selling off. You know, it means actually selling off to the private sector. If we did that, as you said, it could lead to the end of the NHS as we know it. It could lead to the end of free healthcare. And the most precious thing about the NHS, it is free at the point of need when we need it. And we have to keep it that way. But that's not happening. I mean, nobody's talking about privatising the NHS. Nobody's talking about selling it off. What is happening, because of the bill that you've talked about, is that some of these local commissioning groups, you know, which are run by doctors, are giving contracts to private groups and also to charities like Macmillan Cancer. That is what's happening. That is an experiment. Nobody quite knows where it's going to go.
It's an experiment that has no end, and it's an experiment that is inefficient.
Can you let me finish? I've, as a journalist, spent 5 years looking at the NHS, going around the NHS. The thing that most has struck me about the NHS, as a patient and as a journalist, is that we have brilliant, excellent care in some parts of the NHS. We have the best care in the world. And in other parts of the NHS, I'm sorry, we have terrible care. And the variability of care is a real problem for all of us. And what we have to do is we have to improve outcomes for patients. Right. Now, I personally don't mind who provides the diagnostic test or who provides a small piece of it. I don't mind if it's Macmillan. I don't necessarily mind if it's the private sector. Now, I don't want Serco, which is, I think, what people think about when they worry about this, and it's totally understandable. I'm not sure I want Serco running something.
Okay, I think we get the point.
But I don't think that's what's on the table. I just want to say that we just need to be very careful that we don't shut down small attempts to possibly make things better for patients.
It will be about about the shareholder in the end. It won't be about the patient. You shouldn't be making profit out of illness. It's as simple as that.
Nigel Farage.
Well, I agree with Camilla. There is an entirely false debate going on. I think Labour have chosen to make the NHS at the absolute centrepiece of their general election campaign. And so the word privatisation is bandied about without really meaning anything. I mean, this is something that I've thought about. We've got an ageing population. The demand for health services is going to go up over the next few years hugely from where we are now. I've looked at, what happens in France, what happens in the Netherlands. They tend to use more insurance-based systems. We as a party have decided that the NHS being free at the point of care is absolutely vital, and that actually the involvement of the private sector that we saw under Labour and continuing now has not thus far been a great success. Take the PFI contracts, the private finance initiatives. New hospitals were built, but rather than going to borrow money, on the gilts market, in that horrible city place where they're all crooks and everything, and rather than doing that, what Labour did was to go to really rich people in private equity groups. So we borrowed 50 billion sterling to build new hospitals, which we built, and no question, but the repayments on that are 300 billion sterling. We have outsourced all sorts of contracts like cleaning of hospitals, and look at what the results have been. So my answer to the question is, in the short term, rather than outsourcing to the private sector the functions of the National Health Service, why don't we get a grip and run what we have better and do it ourselves and not make so much big cash for private equity?
And so you dropped the idea of insurance policies?
No, we had a debate about the idea, and it's quite right that all political parties, before they formulate policies, should have a big, open debate, and that nothing should be off the table. You should debate.
But you're saying it's off the table now, as far as you.
I'm saying that we will fight a general election, saying we think that the outsourcing to private firms that we've seen under the last two governments has not delivered good value for money or good patient health care.
But you still want free at the point of demand or supply?
Absolutely.
All right. Russell Brand.
I think that, like everyone, that the NHS is one of the great cornerstones of our culture. I spent some time in America, and you're charged for healthcare there, and it seems sort of unnatural to receive a bill after you've been bandaged up in an ostentatious manner in an accent. I think I spoke to some care workers recently in this care workers union. They said since their local health authority had private engagement, their wages had been cut by 9%, and agency workers on minimum wage had been brought in. They said that they couldn't provide the care they needed to patients. So obviously I think that profit, as that gentleman says, has no business anywhere near healthcare. I think it should be kept well away from it. I've spent a lot of time in NHS hospitals over the last year. They're doing incredible work, and I think that it's something that we should preserve and fight for. I'm very worried that there are 71 members of Parliament currently that stand to benefit from further privatisation of the NHS, and this makes me feel further disillusioned with our current parliamentary process.
Okay.
Before I got into Parliament, I was a director of Diabetes UK, and we were one of the organisations that would be counted as independent sector who worked with the NHS. We were using public money, NHS money, to help improve NHS services, to develop for people with diabetes what a year of care would look like. So I think that there have been huge successes from doing this, from allowing public money to be used by other organisations to benefit the NHS. Under Labour, numbers of private sector organisations and independent sector organisations was about 5% of the NHS spend. Now it's 6%. So this is not like massive amounts of independent sector organisations running NHS services. The other thing I would just add as well is this is wider than care you receive in hospitals, care you receive in the community in GP surgeries. The other role that the private sector and other sectors can play in improving our National Health Service is in medical research.
But I just want to bring it up the political point, even though people shout Bunch and Judy. Mary Creagh was talking about privatising the NHS. Do you see Tory policy, as in the way you're describing it, as being in effect privatising the NHS?
No, I agree with Camilla's point, and I think that, again, this is an institution that is incredibly important to us. Ed Miliband spoke the other day about weaponising the National Health Service. I mean, it's just too important to have that kind of debate
what is
about it. Well, it is.
What is
in effect, it's using it as a political
Ed Miliband said something that
and actually,
she doesn't understand.
These issues, well, that's probably not rare. This is about an institution that is so important. It's continually the top issue that the public care about, and we have to have grown-up conversations about it.
All right.
Can I just make my point about the life sciences?
Yeah,
it's a really important point.
Go on then.
The NHS is important. How come you've just got an 11% pay rise when the nurses were awarded 1% and the nurse I spoke to today hasn't even got that, and she hasn't had a pay rise for 7 years?
I completely understand that. I can't speak for my. I can't speak for my other colleagues in Parliament, but I can tell you, if I am an MP in the next Parliament, when a pay rise comes in, I will not take it. I will not take it, and I will tell you why. In politics, we put ourselves up to make decisions for people, to try and get people to change their behaviour, to persuade a business to set up another business, to employ more people, to take risks. We're there to try and persuade people who maybe haven't been in work to go and get into work. And I think we would not have credibility doing that if we were to do something
Okay,
like that.
so
That's my
he doesn't understand that. Let him on. You don't seem satisfied with their answer.
Not at all.
What's the problem?
She hasn't answered it. I expected her to say it wasn't their decision. It was a pay sector board.
Well, that's true, but it's
the
my
nurses
decision
had a
whether
pay
to take
sector
it or
board
not.
as well, and the civil service. I'm a civil servant. I haven't had a pay rise.
Okay.
If we're going to talk about, can we just say one
very
thing on
briefly,
pay?
yes, and
If
then
we're going to talk about pay,
Yes.
I want to just amplify what Russell said about care workers. And I don't think it's actually much to do with private anything. It's care workers who are doing a really difficult job. They are having to go into people's homes, the homes of strangers they don't know, and deal with what they find, sometimes on a 15-minute contract. And some of them, a lot of them, are not even being paid the minimum wage. And if we're going to talk about pay, those are the people who really need to...
All right. Very briefly, Mary. Very briefly. Very briefly, please.
We talked a lot about abstracts, but in terms of the NHS, more people are waiting longer to see their GPs. More than 1 million people have waited more than 4 hours in A&E, which is why we have said we would bring in a mansion tax to create a time to care fund to have more home care workers, 20,000 more nurses and more GPs.